I knew something was wrong the
This
second
is
my card
completely
declined. It
unacceptable.
wasn't a big
You can't
purchase.
just charge
Just
me
groceries,
$12,000 and
milk,
lock my
eggs,
accounts.
bread.
We followed the
Transaction
procedure.
declined. I smiled
Zero
awkwardly at the
dollars? How
cashier.
is that
Tried
possible?
again.
I'm
Declined.
strict. This
That's
can't
when
be
the embarrassment
happening.
hit.
I need
I
to
checked my
call
banking
now.
app while standing there. Available balance, $0. That was impossible. 3 days earlier, my consulting payment had cleared. 5 figures. I'd seen it myself. Then I saw the alert notification. Account restricted, legal hold applied. Legal hold? I stepped aside, heart racing, and opened the detailed notice. Account temporarily frozen pending review of lien enforcement request. Lien enforcement request. Requested by Green Valley Community Association, my HOA. I actually laughed, out loud, because there had to be a mistake. HOAs can file liens on property, yes, but freeze a personal bank account? That requires legal escalation, court involvement, paperwork, authority, and I hadn't even received a final notice. Or so I thought. When I got home, I checked my mailbox. There it was, a letter dated 5 days earlier. Notice of immediate assessment recovery action. They claimed I owed $12,740 in emergency structural reserve contributions. Emergency. Funny thing is, I'm on the finance committee. I review every reserve allocation quarterly, and there was no emergency, no vote, no approval, no reserve deficit. So how exactly did a $12,740 emergency assessment appear? And how did it escalate into a bank freeze without my knowledge? I logged into the HOA internal portal, the committee dashboard. Access denied. My credentials were disabled. That's when the pattern started forming. 3 weeks earlier, during our quarterly finance review, I had asked a simple question. Why was the legal and enforcement line item 280% over budget? The property manager said it was due to compliance actions. But when I requested breakdown invoices, they deferred. Twice. Then I noticed something else in the quarterly sheet. A new reserve account labeled Asset Protection Recovery Fund. It had $418,000 in it, created only 6 months ago. Source of funds? Owner enforcement collections. Meaning fines, meaning penalties, meaning pressure money. And now suddenly I had a $12,740 emergency assessment, and my bank account was frozen? Coincidence? No, this was retaliation. I called the bank. After 27 minutes on hold, I finally spoke to the legal department. They confirmed a lien enforcement request had been filed through a partnered legal recovery firm. The firm had submitted documentation claiming unpaid HOA assessment tied to property lien authorization. Temporary freeze applied pending review. I asked one question. Was there a court order? Silence. Then, we are reviewing documentation provided. Translation? No confirmed court order yet. Just aggressive legal pressure. That's when it hit me. They weren't trying to collect money. They were trying to intimidate me. Because 2 weeks ago, in a private committee email thread, I had written this. I formally request independent audit review of the Asset Protection Recovery Fund, and I had CC'd all 5 board members, including the HOA president. 3 days later, my portal access was revoked. 5 days later, I received an emergency assessment. 7 days later, my bank account was frozen. Sequence matters. This wasn't random. This was strategic. So I drove to the HOA management office, walked in calmly, asked to speak to the president. She came out smiling, polite, controlled. I placed a bank freeze notice on the desk between us. Her expression didn't change. You're escalating things unnecessarily, she said softly. No, I replied. You are. She folded her hands. You owe the association $12,740. For what emergency? Structural reserve stabilization. That fund had a $418,000 balance last quarter. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You no longer have access to internal documents. That's when I leaned forward. And you forgot something. Her smile faded. I still have downloaded copies. Silence. I could see it. The calculation behind her eyes. They thought I'd panic. They thought I'd quietly pay to unfreeze my account. Most homeowners would, because frozen money creates fear, pressure, embarrassment. But here's the part they forgot. I sit on the finance committee. I know where every reserve dollar is supposed to go, and if they just use enforcement mechanisms without proper vote authorization, this isn't just retaliation. It's abuse of fiduciary authority, which isn't an HOA violation. It's civil liability. As I stood up to leave, I said one thing: "I'll see you at the emergency board meeting." She blinked. "There is no emergency meeting scheduled." I smiled. "There will be." Because while my account was frozen, I was about to freeze something much bigger. I didn't sleep that night because once you realize your bank account has been frozen without a confirmed court order, you stop thinking emotionally and start thinking structurally. And structurally, nothing about this made sense. Because lien enforcement is a slow legal process. It requires documented delinquency, certified notice periods, board vote authorization, and eventually court acknowledgement. But what happened to me felt accelerated, engineered, almost rehearsed, and the only reason you accelerate enforcement like that is if you're trying to create pressure before someone digs too deep, which is exactly what I had been doing when I questioned the legal and enforcement line item 3 weeks earlier during our quarterly review meeting, where I asked why expenses had jumped nearly 280% year over year and why a newly created asset protection recovery fund was absorbing hundreds of thousands in owner penalties without a matching increase in disclosed litigation activity, and at the time, the property manager dismissed it as standard compliance escalation. But now with my account frozen and my portal access revoked, that explanation felt like a cover story rather than an answer. The next morning, I went to the bank in person and asked to speak directly to someone in the legal risk department. And after 20 minutes of waiting, I was seated across from a compliance officer who confirmed that the freeze request had come through a third-party legal recovery firm acting on behalf of the HOA. And when I asked whether a judge had signed a court order authorizing seizure or restriction, he hesitated and said they were reviewing the documentation provided, which is corporate language for "we haven't verified judicial authority yet." And that was the moment the situation shifted in my mind from a debt dispute to a procedural abuse scenario, because if they submitted documentation implying court-backed enforcement without actually having it, that crosses from aggressive collection into potential misrepresentation. When I got home, I opened every financial PDF I had downloaded over the last year and began cross-referencing them line by line. And what stood out immediately was a $96,000 annual legal consulting retainer approved just 3 months ago, categorized as preventative enforcement advisory. Yet the meeting minutes attached to that quarter showed only 2 board member signatures approving the expense, even though our bylaws clearly state that any contractual obligation exceeding $50,000 requires majority board roll call approval, which means at least 4 members. And when I checked the portal for the official vote transcript, the document link was gone, replaced with generic "file unavailable" message. But I still had the screenshot from the day it was originally uploaded because I make a habit to archive anything that looks irregular. Then I compared the timeline. The retainer was approved, enforcement revenue spiked. The Asset Protection Recovery Fund ballooned past $400,000, and shortly after I formally requested an independent audit review in writing to the full board, my committee credentials were revoked and an emergency structural reserve assessment of $12,740 suddenly appeared under my account. And within days, a lien enforcement request had reached my bank, which was too precise to be coincidence and too fast to be accidental, because bureaucracies don't move quickly unless someone is pushing them hard. I started calling other finance committee members discreetly, and while 2 claimed they had received any unusual assessments, one admitted he'd been hit with a $9,300 compliance recovery contribution after questioning landscaping contract renewals, and that confirmed what I suspected: selective targeting. Not random enforcement, but strategic pressure applied to individuals who asked inconvenient financial questions. By late afternoon, I received a call from an attorney identifying himself as association counsel who said he wanted to resolve the matter amicably, which is a kind of phrasing lawyers use when they prefer settlement over discovery, and he suggested that if I satisfied the emergency assessment promptly, the bank restriction could be lifted quickly and the lien process halted. But when I asked him directly whether a court order had been obtained authorizing asset restriction, he pivoted and said the association was operating within its governing authority, which carefully avoids answering the question. So I told him I would consider payment immediately after the board publicly announced an independent third-party audit of the Asset Protection Recovery Fund and disclosed the full terms of the $96,000 retainer contract, and the silence that followed lasted just long enough to confirm I had hit something real. An hour later, an email notification appeared in my inbox. Emergency executive session. Board members only. Scheduled for following morning at 9 a.m., and attached to it was a separate notice stating that my Finance Committee access privileges had been temporarily suspended pending internal review. But there was a procedural flaw in that move as well, because committee removal requires formal board vote and documented notice served a member, neither of which I had received, meaning that legally I still retain my seat until properly removed, and if they attempted to hold an executive session affecting financial governance without acknowledging my status, that could constitute a governance violation in itself. That night I printed every relevant bylaw section, every financial discrepancy, every screenshot of deleted meeting minutes, and placed them neatly into a folder, because if they believed freezing my account would make me fold, they misunderstood something fundamental about how leverage works. And the truth is, once someone has already crossed a line into intimidation, you have nothing left to fear from exposure. And as I looked at the folder on my desk, I realized tomorrow's emergency session wasn't about my $12,740 assessment anymore. It was about whether the board had overstepped its legal authority in a way that could unravel the entire enforcement system they had built. And if they had misused that retainer contract to accelerate lien actions without proper judicial backing, then the freeze on my account might not be the biggest mistake they made. It might be the smallest. At 8:47 a.m., I walked into the clubhouse conference room carrying a thin black folder, not because it looked dramatic, but because I wanted everything
the retainer is
organized, documented, and ready.
but no
and when
court
I opened
order.
the door, the conversation inside stopped mid-sentence,
Motion to halt
which told me two
enforcement
things
now.
immediately. First, they had expected me to show up, and second, whatever they were discussing involved me. The HOA president was seated at the head of the table, the property manager to her right, and the association attorney on speakerphone in the center of the table. 4 board members were present, a quorum, an official meeting. You're not part of this session, the president said evenly. According to which vote? I asked calmly as I took a seat. She glanced at the property manager. Your committee privileges were suspended. Committee privileges require a recorded majority vote and written notice. I replied, sliding a printed bylaw section across the table. Section 4.3. You'll find that highlighted. No one picked it up. The attorney's voice crackled through the speaker. This is an executive legal discussion. About me, I said, which makes it governance, not private counsel. Silence. Then I placed the next document on the table. The screenshot of the $96,000 legal retainer approval, showing only 2 signatures. This contract exceeds the financial authorization threshold defined in the bylaws. It required majority roll call approval. It didn't receive it. The president leaned back. You're misinterpreting procedural flexibility. Procedural flexibility doesn't override governing documents, I said, and it certainly doesn't authorize accelerated lien enforcement without confirmed court validation. The room shifted. That sentence landed. One of the quieter board members finally spoke. What do you mean without court validation? I turned slightly toward him. My bank confirmed there was no verified judicial freeze order attached to the lien enforcement submission, only documentation from the association's legal firm. The property manager immediately cut in. That's standard prejudgment protection. It's also potentially misrepresentative if the submission implies court-backed enforcement authority that hasn't yet been granted. I replied. The attorney's voice sharpened slightly. You're making serious allegations. No, I said evenly. I'm asking serious questions. Then I slid the final document forward. The financial growth chart of the Asset Protection Recovery Fund, showing nearly $500,000 collected in less than a year through owner enforcement contributions. This fund has expanded aggressively, I continued, yet disclosed litigation expenses do not match the rate of collection. Where is the surplus allocated? No one answered immediately. That hesitation was louder than any defense. Finally, the president folded her hands. Compliance enforcement protects property values. Then why are committee members who question enforcement being selectively assessed? I asked. That shifted the temperature in the room. The quiet board member looked at the president. Is that true? The property manager jumped in again. Assessments are applied based on violation metrics. Then provide the engineering study supporting my emergency structural reserve charge. I said, provide the municipal complaint reference. Provide the third-party report justifying accelerated lien escalation. Nothing. The attorney broke in. This discussion is unproductive. Discovery would be productive. I replied calmly, and that word, discovery, changed everything, because discovery means court. Discovery means subpoenas. Discovery means financial transparency under oath. The president's composure cracked just slightly. Are you threatening litigation? I'm requesting compliance. I answered. If compliance requires litigation, that's your choice. One of the other board members spoke quietly. Was there actually a structural emergency? No one responded. He repeated it. Was there? The president avoided eye contact. The attorney shifted tone. Perhaps we should consider a temporary pause on enforcement while internal review is conducted. That was the first retreat. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. The president exhaled slowly. We can discuss suspension of the assessment pending review. Not suspension, I corrected gently. Full withdrawal until independent audit verification. The room felt tight now, because at this point it wasn't about my frozen account. It was about whether the board had authorized financial mechanisms improperly, whether enforcement funds were being used to justify a retainer that wasn't lawfully approved, and whether accelerated lien pressure was being deployed strategically to silence oversight. The quiet board member looked at the others. If there's even a possibility of procedural error, we need to address immediately. The attorney spoke again, carefully now. An independent audit may not be necessary. It becomes necessary the moment financial governance is questioned. I replied. The president stared at me for several seconds. Then she said something she probably didn't mean to say out loud. You're destabilizing the association. No, I said quietly. I'm stabilizing it. Silence filled the room again. Finally, she looked at the property manager. Draft a motion for a temporary enforcement halt. That was the second retreat. Small, but significant. My bank account wasn't unfrozen yet. The assessment wasn't officially withdrawn, but the enforcement machine had just slowed down. And when systems built on pressure slowed down, they start to crack. As I gathered my folder and stood up, the attorney added one last line through the speaker. This matter is not concluded. I paused at the door. I know, I replied, because if they thought pausing enforcement would make this disappear, they still didn't understand the real problem. The moment governance integrity is questioned publicly, it doesn't fade, it expands. And now at least 2 board members were visibly uncertain, which means the next vote wouldn't be unanimous. And once division starts inside leadership, control starts slipping. The enforcement halt email went out to the full board that afternoon, but it didn't go out to homeowners. And that detail mattered because transparency only works when it's visible, and what the president tried to do was contain the damage quietly.
How was this
frame it as a procedural pause rather than a structural problem. But once internal doubt enters a board, containment becomes nearly impossible, especially when financial oversight is involved. The following morning, I received confirmation from my bank that the legal recovery firm had voluntarily withdrawn the immediate restriction request pending further validation, which is corporate language for we're stepping back before this turns into liability. And by noon, my account balance was fully accessible again, no penalties, no fees, no formal apology, just a quiet reversal as if it had never happened. Except it had happened. And once you attempt to freeze someone's personal funds without airtight authority, you don't get to pretend it was routine. But the real shift happened 3 days later during the scheduled open board meeting, because one of the previously silent members requested that the Asset Protection Recovery Fund be reviewed publicly under new business. And you could see the president tense immediately, because she understood what that meant. The numbers would no longer stay inside executive sessions. When the financial summary appeared on projector screen, the growth of the fund was undeniable, nearly $500,000 collected through owner enforcement in less than 12 months, paired with a $96,000 legal retainer, and significantly lower disclosed litigation expenditures than the revenue suggested. And when a homeowner in the audience asked why enforcement collections exceeded actual legal costs by such a margin, the room grew very quiet. The property manager attempted to frame the surplus as proactive stabilization, but another board member asked a question that changed everything. Was a retainer contract properly approved under Section 4.3? No one answered immediately, because documentation doesn't lie. And when governing documents are printed and sitting in front of everyone, interpretation becomes limited. After several uncomfortable minutes, the attorney recommended commissioning an independent third-party audit to eliminate uncertainty and preserve community confidence, which was the same audit I had requested weeks earlier, except now it wasn't framed as my demand. It was framed as risk management, which is how institutions back down without admitting fault. The motion passed, not unanimously, but it passed. 2 weeks later, preliminary audit findings were delivered to the board, and while the full details were not released publicly at first, what became clear internally was that enforcement acceleration procedures had indeed been implemented more aggressively than required, that the retainer approval process had procedural deficiencies, and that documentation standards for emergency assessments lacked sufficient third-party validation safeguards. In simpler terms, the system had been stretched beyond what the bylaws clearly allowed. The president resigned 3 days after that closed session. Official reason: personal time commitments. The property manager's contract was not renewed at the end of the quarter. The legal firm's retainer was restructured under majority vote with capped enforcement authority and explicit court confirmation requirements prior to any asset restriction filings. And as for my $12,740 emergency assessment, it was formally withdrawn in writing. No fine, no lien, no enforcement record. Just a short letter stating the charge had been issued in error pending review. Error. That word carries a lot of weight when it follows an attempted bank freeze. At the next community meeting, enforcement policies were rewritten to require transparent reporting of reserve fund growth and explicit member disclosure for any enforcement-related revenue exceeding projected legal expenditure thresholds, which sounds technical, but what it really means is this: pressure tactics don't survive sunlight. After the meeting ended, one of the board members who had stayed quiet during the early stages approached me and said something simple. I didn't realize how far it had gone. That's usually how these things work. Power rarely announces when it crosses the line. It inches forward until someone forces it into the open. They thought freezing my bank account would scare me into compliance. They thought the threat of lien escalation would isolate me. They thought removing my portal access would limit what I could prove. What they forgot was simple. When someone understands the numbers, understands the bylaws, and documents everything, pressure stops being leverage and starts becoming exposure. And exposure spreads faster than enforcement. The irony is this could have ended quietly with a small fine. But the moment they chose intimidation over transparency, they turned a $12,740 assessment into a governance overhaul. They froze my account. They triggered an audit. They tried to silence oversight. They lost control of the narrative. And in the end, the only thing permanently frozen was the enforcement system they built.